So, last time we discussed the bottom rank, 40% of the urban workforce. Now, 40% of 45% is approximately 18%, if I'm correct. I think so. Yeah, it's 18%. So we could say 1 out of 6 workers, 1 out of 6 people in the United States was part of this group that was the focus of a lot of attention, political and cultural, and has continued to be the focus of a lot of historical work, in part because there was so much stuff at the time focused on this group of people. Probably, I mean, if we factor in rural poverty, which is more difficult to, has proven to be more elusive in terms of how you define it and where you find it. Probably 1 out of 3 people in the United States in the last 2 decades of the 19th century was living in poverty. The current poverty rate is 15%. A little bit more than twice today. 10 years, well, in 2000 it was 11%. So we're going back in the direction of more poverty. As a point of comparison, in 2000, Brazil had a 28% poverty rate. It's now 12%. So they've been going down, we've been going up, and actually we seem to be doing worse than Brazil right now. But that's the nature of things. The unskilled group, one of the things I think that needs to be pointed out about them is that they were not generally active in the union movement. They were not the primary source of the labor question per se, but they took up a disproportionate amount of discussion, in part because extreme poverty had not existed, or people had thought it had not existed in the United States prior to 1880. So with the emergence of an urban working class, the bottom layer of it was living at a level, a type of life that Americans had assumed they were exempt from. The country was exempt from the kind of life that existed only in Europe, in London or Berlin or Paris or places like that. And suddenly it was over here. So that was an issue of debate. How did it get here? Was it due to American capitalism and the way it operated, or was it due to desperately poor people from Europe coming over to the United States and bringing their poverty with them? And that was a big issue of supposition and assertion and debate. Usually debate based on suppositions and assertions rather than on research and facts. The second thing that's important to point out is that the single biggest indicator of poverty was not race or ethnicity, but gender. If you were a woman, head of a household, you almost certainly lived in poverty and were in this group. A black male who was working was probably on the edge of this group, but a little bit above. Men would go in and out of it, but women stayed in deep poverty throughout. So if your husband was killed in an industrial accident, which was not uncommon, if your husband died from crossing the street and was hit by a streetcar, got pneumonia and died, cancer, so you would be plunged into this, you and your children would likely be plunged into this group unless, maybe you had family that you could rely on. So 45% of the American urban working class in the late 1880s earned between $500 and $800 a year. They had enough money so they would not go hungry, as long as they remained employed. They could rent an apartment with separate bedrooms for the parents and the children. And if they were particularly fortunate, they could even have 3 bedrooms. So one for the male children and another one for the female children. They could afford dues to the fraternal organization that the father inevitably belonged to. And they could occasionally go out on an outing, Coney Island if you lived in New York, or take a vacation at a near campsite that had cabins and so forth. It was particularly in this group, excuse me, that the better paid workers, the people that sort of moving towards the higher end of this group, took in a boarder to get some extra income, often a family member. Public services in the slightly better sections of town where the semi-skilled lived were still limited. This group in particular pursued a strategy of becoming property owners whenever they could. And they actually were quite successful in doing this. They would buy undeveloped property on the edge of the city and then start building the homes by themselves using sweat equity. So Olivier Zunz, a historian who's looked at Detroit from 1880 to 1920, has determined that well over half of the working class in Detroit built their home this way, by buying undeveloped land on the outskirts of Detroit and then over a several-year period building up a home, which probably, had there been building codes at that time, the first building codes are passed in 1912, but had there been building codes, they certainly wouldn't have passed the building codes. If you go to places in San Francisco, those of you who know San Francisco, much of the Excelsior district was developed initially this way by working class families who worked closer into the center of San Francisco and then buying property in what was then undeveloped, essentially undeveloped farmland, and constructing their home. Or in Los Angeles, the extension down into South Central and West, along West Adams and into the Crenshaw, also started with this kind of process of workers doing it themselves. This way, if they own their own property, and they did it in a way that they didn't have a mortgage, they just had to pay their property taxes, if something happened to the husband, to the father, the property still belonged to the widow. And she was not at the mercy of slumlords. She would have some cushion. This group also was very much concerned about death insurance and a little bit later life insurance. Death insurance because everyone was afraid that they were going to die when they died, or somebody in the family died, there wouldn't be any money to pay for the funeral and the burial. And so one of the main things that fraternal organizations did, and these were almost entirely ethnic based, was to provide death insurance. So for a few pennies a week out of your paycheck, the fraternal organization would then pay for your funeral and burial plot if something bad happened. And then a little bit later, life insurance, so that if you died, your family could get a couple of $1,000s, which would tide them over. So this was the group that was trying to protect itself against the uncertainties. So let's see. De-skilling, well, actually, before we go into this, let's look at an area. We'll come back to it a little bit later, but an area outside in the far south side of Chicago that was built largely for semi-skilled workers. Pullman Village. It was a workers' housing area that was developed in the 1880s and then expanded in the 1890s for workers who worked for the Pullman Car Company. The Pullman Company built all of the passenger cars for railroads in the United States, but also in much of the world. So they had fairly narrow single-family homes. So row housing. The homes still exist. They also had apartment buildings in this area. If you worked for Pullman, he would then rent you an apartment or a house. George Pullman. And the homes were nice, modest by our standards, but nice. And he also provided things like he built a church, which then the various denominations in the community had to rotate. And this is a photograph of the same community, or the main street in the same community, because there were shops. They're taken in the 1890s. So, this would be a typical kind, more than the South, we tend to think of tenements in New York City as the standard for how urban workers live. But actually, this kind of housing that you would find in Chicago or Cleveland or Pittsburgh or outside on the outskirts of Philadelphia or in Detroit was actually much more common for how the urban working class lived. And most cities were spreading out, so there wasn't the necessity of pressing people into these famously congested buildings that existed in Manhattan. Even in Boston, the housing was more like this. The neighborhoods were more like this. And this is an example of one of the many, the Pullman, the upholstery room, one of the many departments at the Pullman plant, which was just right across the main street from the housing. So you had carpentry plants, you had electrical, you had carpentry, upholstery. It was also unusual in that it was a multi-ethnic and multi-racial housing project. Well, George Pullman didn't like the system of having jobs identified by ethnicity, so he tried, in his form of welfare capitalism, to break that down. But nonetheless, there seemed to be, within Pullman, which had about 10,000 people, because he had 10,000 people working for him, there seemed to be areas that were Italian, African American, German, and so forth. Now, for most of this group of the semi-skilled working class, de-skilling was the constant threat that they faced. Would the employer introduce new machinery that would downgrade the nature of the work you were doing, and consequently the wages you received? Would another ethnic group raid